All right, I will say good morning. Good morning. Let us begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning. Share to thank our TAMLUD Torah sponsor for the month of Iyar, an anonymous sponsorship with Hakaras Hatov, to Hashem for all the blessings He has bestowed upon us, and for refuah Shleima for Devorah Leah bas Chaya Rivka. May we always zoche Hashem to witness the imminent coming of mashiach. Mihira b'yameinu. Amen. Our week of learning sponsors, Milton Melanie Gertner, in honor of the wedding of their son Drew Ari to Shira Shamouilian in Yerushalayim. We wish the chassan in Kala tremendous bracha, mazel, and simcha. And Daf Yomi Shir is sponsored today by friends of Dovid Flamm. Is David here?
Yeah, a lot of friends.
Baruch Hashem. Oh, I meant friend. No, friends. There are a lot of friends. Friends of Dovid Flamm. Today is David's 40th birthday. Wow, listen to this. This is actually really nice. A stalwart member of the Daf. We could, whatever. We're going to talk. We'll talk later on. Dovid brings laughter, knowledge, smiles, ruchnius, unique commentary, that I believe, and dedication to our Daf. Dovid is cherished and loved. Happy birthday, Dovid, and thank you for who you are. What is schus? Just you should know, schus to have friends who could write those kind of words about you. David, zachisa, to mamish have a chavra like that. Absolutely beautiful. But on a serious, David, happy birthday. I'd may have asked him shanim tovos, and it's incredible. You share a birthday with Yoni Frager, so it's really incredible. Good. Every day is Yoni's birthday. So again, David, really, mamish beautiful. I may have asked him shanim tovos. Mazel bracha simcha. And besoros tovos all of Klal Yisrael. Incredible. Say, all right, let us begin. Really, so special to see things like that. It reminds me. It's the Gemara of Choni HaMa'agel, right? Choni, the circle drawer, who again, fell asleep and woke up so many years later, not realizing what happened, and said the words, O chavrusa, O mitusa. Either give me friends or give me death. In other words, that he recognized that a life without friends and a life without chevra and a life that's just a solitary life is such something that is so lacking and so absent. So Baruch Hashem, always beautiful to see when you see such beautiful cherished, such beautiful friendship within the ranks of Klal Yisrael. Truly inspiring. Should be a schus for our entire people. Amen. All right, I will say with that, let us begin. We have a lot to do today. Baruch Hashem, today's daf is Peites 89, and we are picking up. We actually did really great yesterday. We left off 2 lines up from the bottom. Ravina Amar. So we'll say, if you remember again, we're focused over here really on what we'll call 4 different parts. It's 4 different parts to our conversation, which are all interrelated. The idea has to do with our topic is the ability of a worker, a laborer, as well as an animal to be able to partake of the food, of the produce when they're working on it. So remember again, each of those components, Adam, or I should say a worker and an animal, are divided up into 2 parts, mechuber and talosh, right? From partaking of attached produce and detached produce. So remember again, the parts we know that are, so yeah, we have 2 psukim. Again, we're not going to go through everything, but Lamaisa, that's what we've been focused on over here, trying to understand the permission. Just keep going. The permission for the animal and the worker to be able to go ahead and partake of these items. So Ravina says as follows: Lo adam matalosh v'lo sharba mechubar tzrichi kroi. So Ravina says like this: you don't really need a pasuk for adam matalosh, for a person to partake of detached produce. And you don't need a pasuk for sharba mechuber. Why? Because the pasuk says, "Lo zatzum shar b'dishom." Now the pasuk itself says that you can't muzzle an ox when you thresh. Okay, so the Gemara says like this. Well, it's the top of Peites. Now remember again, we do have a couple of psukim in this context. Number 1 is lo zatzum shar b'dishom, so you can't muzzle a shar when it's threshing. Now again, remember the pashtos threshing is dealing with what kind of produce? What kind of produce? Detached. Right, because remember again, you're taking harvested wheat, putting it on the ground, and the animal's literally trampling over it to separate out the wheat from the chaff. So I have that pasuk. So watch what Ravina does. Top of Peites 89a, top line. Michti kol mili isnu bechasima diafinan shar mishabes. So here's what's interesting. In general, when the Torah would tell you that you're not allowed to muzzle your animal when it threshes, so every animal is included in that. Right? Every animal is included in that, because again we have this gzera shava of shar of Shabbos. Rashi points out this entire gzera shava. Top Rashi kilomar al karchach lav shar lav dafka v'chol shar behemos isnu b'taras chasima diafinan shar mishabes b'perak shar shelagach hasapara. Tichsiv. There's It's not holy, right? It is? Okay, thank you, sorry. So we'll say, so in general, we have a concept that whenever the Torah goes ahead and expresses a halacha when it comes to an animal, thank you. Good enough. It's good. It's perfect. Yeah? Okay. Whenever the Torah goes ahead and writes the particular animal by a particular prohibition, it's understood that it applies to all animals. So, for example, when the Torah says "Lo sachsum shar b'disho," don't muzzle an ox, we understand based on Xera Shav, just like the Torah says, you can't work your animals on Shabbos. And the Torah discusses shar and chamar, but we understand it applies to all animals. So, when the Torah says don't muzzle your ox is not specific; it applies to all animals. The Gemara says, "Im kein lichtov rachmana lo sidosh bechasimo." So let the Torah just say, do not thresh with a muzzled animal. Why the need to go ahead and write shar? Shar the kasev rachmana lamali. So why do you need to write shar? La kushe chosem l'nechsam v'nechsam l'chosem. So Rabbi say this is incredible. The word shar comes to teach me. Watch this. That we equate the muzzler with the muzzlee. I don't know if that's the right term, but the muzzlee with the muzzler, right? In other words, that we equate the animal that is muzzled with the person who muzzles it, and the muzzler, the person with the shar. What does that mean? Ma chosim ochel b'mechubar, just like the chosim, just like the muzzler, who's the person, right? Who's the owner. If he were to go ahead and be working in the field, he'd be permitted to eat b'mechubar, because we already established that based on the pasuk. Af nechsam ochel b'mechubar. So too again, the muzzled animal could also eat the mechubar. Umar nechsam ocha b'talosh, and just like again the muzzled animal has the ability to consume b'talosh, av chosem ocha b'talosh, so too the muzzler could also go ahead and eat from detached property. Okay, so Rabbi say here's the good news. The good news with this is everyone is agreeing on the bottom line. And the bottom line is a laborer is permitted to go ahead when he's working with the produce, can eat from attached and detached produce. And halacha l'maisa, an animal when it's working is permitted to eat from attached and detached produce. Everyone is agreeing with those principles. The machlokes is how you get there. The machlokes is the drasha. All right, let's go back there. Tan Rabbanan, dayish. So the pasuk says, remember, lo sachsam shar b'disho. You can't muzzle an animal when it's threshing. So the Gemara says, "Ma dayish miyuchad davar shegidule karka upoal ochelbo." So we'll say, just like dayish is unique in what sense? Number one, it's again you're threshing something that grew from the ground, and it's the same type of thing that a worker would be permitted to consume from when working. Af kol shegidule karka pol ochelbo. So to anything that grows from the ground, a worker has the right to eat from when he's going ahead and doing his job. So we'll say, what does this come to exclude? This is actually very interesting. Yatsa hacholev v'hamechabet v'hamegabein she'in gedulei karka ve'in pol ochabo. So we'll say, this is very interesting. You see, one might have thought that nisvara, just logically, the Torah is telling me that when someone is working for you and they're doing work with food products, it's almost like not right to tell them that they can't eat from it. So therefore, I would have thought maybe it applies to anything. Kamash Malon, no, that I will say it's dafka agricultural work. When does the laborer have the right, have the license to go ahead and consume that which he is working with? Only when it's something gidulei karka. But for example, if he's milking a cow or making cheese, so again, in these situations, he would not be permitted to partake of the item he is working with. So the Gemara says, Lamali, mechisavo bekamre acha nafka. Shabbos says, now it's interesting, the Gemara is learning this out from Daesh. Now here's what's interesting, I will say, is that the Torah is equating an animal that does work with a laborer that does work. And just like the animal when it does work, you can't muzzle it, i.e., it has to be allowed to eat. So to the worker when it does work, has to be allowed to eat. And the paradigmatic example of this is dayish, is threshing. So the Gemara understands that just like threshing is done with something that grows from the ground, so too the license for the laborer to go ahead and consume while he's working is only for things that grow from the ground. So the Gemara says, why do I need to learn this out from dayish? I will say it's simpler. Where does the Torah express the worker's license to consume from food that he is working with? What's the pasuk? when the worker will come into his friend's vineyard to do work. So vineyard is the paradigmatic example. A vineyard obviously is gidulei karka, grows from the ground. So what do you see from here? So learn out from here that the laborer's license to go ahead and consume from produce is daf goen, only when it's from grows from the ground. I'll tell you why. Istrich, I still need dayish. Why? I would have thought hoil uksiv kama l'rabos kol bali kama. So again, when the pasuk said kama, as we saw before yesterday's daf, so kama comes to teach me that this halacha applies to all things standing grain, which means mechuber l'karka. L'rabos nami midi delav gidulei karka ninu. So this is interesting. I might have thought like this. I might have thought that kama. This is fascinating. We've always used kama, which means standing ground, standing wheat, to go ahead and refer to gidulei karka. The Gemara says maybe kama means anything that is standing. So for example, I will say, what's another example of saying that's standing? A cow. Cow is also standing. So I would have thought that if I'm doing work with the cow, milking the cow, I'm making cheese, maybe halacha l'maisa, I should be permitted, if I'm a worker, be permitted to partake of that as well. To which the Gemara says, Kamash Malon, Dainish comes along to teach me that no, this license to consume of the item you are working with only applies to gidulei karka. Only applies to items that grow from the ground. Incredible. Tanya Yidach, another braysa, Dayish, Mag Dayish, Miyuchad. I just want to tell you, you know what the beauty of these Gemaras are? The beauty of these Gemaras are, you could really, these are the kind of Gemaras you could really sit back and enjoy. Why? Because I already know the result. I know what the result is. The beauty of this is it's just the process. Like you can't sit back. I don't mean it like that, but you understand. You have to be actively involved. But lamaisa, it's just nice to know. It's a certain feeling of like inner tranquility, personalistic equilibrium. Right? The universe is in alignment. When I know what the conclusion is going to be, I'm just working through how to get there. So Tanya Idach, another braysa, dayish ma dayish miyuchad davar shebishas kemar malacha. Paul ochabo. So what's another braysa? Dayish. When it says threshing. Just like threshing is unique, that's what Shebishas K'mar Malacha. Paul ochabo. A worker is allowed to eat when he's threshing. So we'll say this is true if it's an animal, if it's a worker. Af kol shehu b'shas K'mar Malacha. Paul ochabo. So what's very important? So too, anything that is in its finished stage, a worker is permitted to go ahead and eat from it. Now, I saying, I just want to point out what's happening over here. So remember again, as much as the worker has the license to consume while he's eating, it has limitations. Limitation number one is gidulei karka. It has to grow from the ground. Now the Gemara is discussing limitation number two. The only time you have the right to go ahead and consume from what you are eating from what you are working with, is when it's b'shas gimar malacha, when you're working with a fully finished product. So I'm harvesting the grapes, they're done. I'm reaping the wheat, it's done, it's finished, gimar malacha. What does that come to exclude? This is fascinating. Yatsa hamenachish b'shume u'bevitzalim hoil ve'in gimar malacha ein po ochabem. This is very interesting. It comes to exclude a case, ultimately again, of where you're weeding onions or garlic. Now, what would happen is apparently with onions and garlic, so it was common that you would weed it. Now, again, the onions and garlic are not finished, but I'm doing weeding. So again, since this work is happening and it's not shas gimar malacha, it's not the time when the produce, when the object, when the item is fully finished. Therefore, what? Therefore, I'm not permitted to eat while I work. Now, I have to show you something absolutely dramatically amazing. Take a look at. I'm sorry, actually, not yet. Sorry. Sarah will say, so therefore, halacha l'maisa, the only time the worker is allowed to go ahead and eat is when? Is halacha l'maisa b'shas k'mar malacha, when the item that he is working with is fully formed. One second. Lamali, so why do I need this whole drasha? I was supposed to say, that's obvious. Why? What does the pasuk say? Me'el kel yocha lo sitei nafka. We already learned this. What does the pasuk say? The pasuk says when you go into the vineyard of your friend and you're working the vineyard and you're harvesting the grapes, you could eat however much you want. What can't you do? You can't take grapes and put it in your basket to bring home for your family or to save for later. That you can't do. Right? You can't take the plate from the kiddush. You can eat whatever you want at the kiddush. There's a reason there's no tinfoil there, right? There's a reason, again, you eat what you want there, you can't take some for shiraya, right? You eat what there is there, you can't take home for the mishpacha. So we'll say, so the idea over here is, but 1 second. So the fact that the Torah says that you can't put it in your basket obviously means that what? We're dealing with fully ripened, fully finished produce. Right? So halacha l'maisa, I already know that from here. Why do I need it? Why do I need it ultimately again from Daish? We'll say, watch this. The Gemara says, "Lo tzricha afagav the kamashlif katini mi beni alimi." So we'll say, no, here's the chat. Apparently, when weeding for onions, not weeding for, right, when weeding onions, so we'll say it was common that even though the major onions were not finished, they would have like these smaller onions that weren't going to grow anymore, right? And therefore, Allah said, quote unquote, they were finished. So those onions are finished. So you might have thought that because those smaller onions aren't going to grow anymore, and they're finished, so that's a finished product, I'm weeding it anyway, you would have thought that you're permitted to partake of that. Kamash molon, no. Kamash will say the only license that a worker has to eat produce that he is working with is when the produce is fully ripened, fully finished, and being harvested in its final state. Now, I will say, I have to show you a dramatically amazing Rashi. Take a look at Rashi. Rashi says over here, the kamashlif katini, which literally means you're removing some of the smaller onions. So we'll say, again, just to be clear, these smaller onions, they're not growing anymore. They're not growing anymore. That's it, and so they have to be removed. Look at Rashi. Kamashlif katini, get ready for this. I've never seen such an incredible Rashi. Yesh b'bitsalin, shemistarsin, v'lo yugasim li'olam. I will say, there are certain onions that are never going to grow to full maturity. This is it, right? Stunted growth, right? This is what it is. They're going to be small onions. The korin osan, balaz sivish, the okrin osan, mibina gidolim. Now, we'll say, now what's the chap? We'll say, this Rashi is kodesh kadoshim. So watch this. What do you do with the smaller stunted onions? What do you do with them? You have to remove them from the soil. Why? Laharchiv makom ulispashet. Because you need to give the bigger onions room to grow. You see, the problem with these smaller onions is they're never going to develop into anything, and they're taking up space. But because they're taking up space, they're preventing the larger onion from expanding and growing into its full potential. So the Gemara says, "Di'ika hashta nesina lekeilah shel ba'al habayis." So we'll say, so therefore that's the chap. So again, on the halachic level, so you might have thought that because these stunted smaller onions, they're finished, so to speak. So you might have thought that the worker has the license to consume them. Kamash malo, no. Since the onion crop is not finished, therefore the worker doesn't have the right to go ahead and partake of it. We'll say, do you understand what this Rashi is telling us? Rashi's telling us? So we'll say, life is filled with stunted onions. Right? Life is a basket of stunted onions, not a box of chocolates, right? Life is a basket of stunted onions. We'll say, the stunted onions are the things in my life that are taking up space. They're taking up space. They're not growing. They're not doing anything. They're not helpful. Now, by the way, they may not be averas, they may not be bad, but they're taking up space in my life. You'll say to yourself, what's the big deal? It's not bad, it's not hurtful, it is bad. What's the problem? Because the stunted onions prevent the regular onions from growing. The onions need space. The onions need makom. But the stunted onions, the things in my life, and we all have our stunted onions, they're the things. They're the midos, the character traits, the behaviors, the activities that I engage in that may not be bad, but they're not helpful. They're just not helpful. I'll say, in life, everything in my life fits into one of two categories. Things that enable and facilitate growth, and things that undermine and stunt growth. There's nothing in between. And we have things in our lives that just take up space. Now, again, not averas, but they're just taking up space. And that space that my beautiful onions could be expanding into. And I will say, what's the entire avoda of life? The entire avoda of life is identify your stunted onions and just uproot them. Because why have stuff in your life that's just taking up space? Whether, again, negative character traits, negative behaviors, negative activities, toxic relationships, whatever it might be, uproot your stunted onions and make room for dynamic, dramatic growth. We should stop here. All right, but we're not. Let's go weiter. Says the Gemara as follows. Tanya Idach, another brisa. Dayish, Shabbos the pasuk says Dayish, ma Dayish miyuchad davar shelo nigmar malachto. Shabbos just like Dayish is unique. Here's what's interesting. Dayish threshing is dafka something where the work is not done, right? Shabbos, remember again, after you thresh wheat, there's a whole bunch of stuff you have to do to get to bread, right? So the Gemara says, Shalom Nigmar Malachtu L'Maiser. So we'll say, so for example, after threshing, before we get to bread, before we get to bread. So threshing, after you thresh wheat, the wheat is not yet subject to Maiser, right? There's a whole bunch of other stuff that has to happen until you get to tithing obligations. So the Gemara says, Yet Paul Ochabo, Af Kol Shalom Nigmar Malachtu L'Maiser Paul Ochabo. So we'll say now another not criteria, what's the word? Another condition. I think maybe condition is the right word. So we'll say, right, what do we have over here? We have so far again, we have Giduli Karka, it has to grow from the ground. Number 2, it has to be finished. In other words, that the growth has to be finished. Now, number 3, the Gemara says, the produce that the worker is partaking of has to be something that is not yet subject to tithing. Right? Which makes sense, right? It can't yet be subject to tithing. That's when the worker is able. And it goes to the example of that, as our Torah says, Dayish. When wheat is being threshed, it's not yet subject to Meiser. Yatzah, this comes to exclude Habolda b'tmara u'begrogros Hov v'nigmra malacht u'lameiser ein pol ochabo. So we'll say, so the example would be over here. So we'll say, so let's say again, what would this come to exclude? Let's say I have a cake of pressed figs. So we'll say, so remember again, I hire a worker now to separate out figs from that cake. So halach l'maisa, the worker can't eat from that. Why can't the worker eat from that? Because since those figs are already a quote unquote a fully finished product, they're subject to Meiser. So because they're subject to Meiser, the worker doesn't have the license to eat from them. So now we have Gidule Karkog, has to grow from the ground. Number 2, it has to be Gemar Malacha, it has to be a fully finished product. And number 3, but not yet subject to tithing obligations. Aiva Tanya, but we learned Haboldo b'tamar b'grogros Paul Ochabo. The Brisa says that if I hire a worker to go ahead and split apart dates or dried figs, then halacha l'maisa again, the worker can't eat from it. So what's going on over here? Amar Papa, that's not a question. Don't worry, it's not a contradiction. Kisanyahi bichoslani. So we'll say what that's talking about over here is underripened figs or dates, which are not really going to fully mature. So we'll say what you do with those is you put them, Rashi points out there, you put them in a reed basket. Choslos, we actually learned about this in Hilchos Muktzah, the concept of choslos. So you put them in this reed basket, and ultimately, again, they mature like that. So because they're underdeveloped, therefore, again, they're not subject yet to Meiser. That's why if the worker does deal with them, the worker has the ability to partake of it. Okay, Tanya Idach, another brisa. Dayish. Pasuk says Dayish, threshing. Ma Dayish miyuchad davar shelo nigmar malachto lechala upol ochabo. So we'll say, what's unique about threshing? So the wheat in that situation is not yet subject to chala. Right? Chala. And therefore the worker is able to eat from it. Af kol davar shelo nigmar malachto lechala pol ochabo. So too again, I will say, anytime a worker is working with produce, and the produce is not yet subject to the din of chala, ultimately the worker has the ability to deal with it, to consume from it. Yatzah, so what does this come to us? Very interesting. Halosh v'hamakatef v'ha'ofa shenigmara malachto lachala de'ein pol ochabo. So this is fascinating, right? If I hire a worker to knead dough, or to shape it, or to bake it, so the worker can't take a little nibble on the dough. Why not? Because since from the time that you knead dough, it's subject to chala, therefore, again, the worker can't eat from it. The Gemara says, but 1 second. Follow nigmar malachto l'maiser. Forget about chala. It's already subject to maiser. We already said before that once whatever the food item you're working with is subject to maiser, the worker is no longer able to eat from it. Lo kasha, this is incredible. Lo kasha b'chutz la'aretz askinan teleka maiser. We're dealing over here with ultimately, again, produce and chutz la'aretz. And produce in chutz la'aretz is not subject to meiser. Ihachi chala nami leka. But I will say, if you're chutz la'aretz, remember, I will say, in chutz la'aretz, there is no biblical obligation of chala either, right? We do chala in chutz la'aretz Right? As a din d'Rabbanan, there's no daraisa of challah, to which the Gemara says, Yachi challah na'amileka el li'olam baretz. Right? There was doing in Eretz Yisrael. Rabbi say this is fascinating. V'lo kasha b'shiva shekivshu or b'shiva shechilku. This is actually fascinating. It's interesting sometimes how like the Gemara really like turns itself into a pretzel to understand something. So we'll say, so therefore the Gemara is saying like this case, this price is talking about the 14 years of what we call kibush v'chiluk. So Rabbi again, remember, there were 14 years under Yoshua in which there was war, and then the dividing up of the land. During those years, Rabbi say, interesting enough, let's look at Damar Sheva shekibshu v'sheva shechilku nischayvu b'chala v'lo nischayva b'maiser. So what's interesting? During those 14 years of what we call kibush v'chiluk, conquering and division, interestingly enough, the laws of maiser did not apply, but the laws of challah did. Rashi points out over here why the distinction. I will say why the distinction. Meiser is the Torah frames Meiser ultimately again when you inherit the land. The Torah goes ahead and frames challah as when you enter the land. It's an interesting distinction. Midi Meiser kagarim, gemar melacha kagarim. I don't understand. It's not Meiser. It's not Meiser which triggers the inability for. It's not Meiser for the worker to consume. Rather, it's gemar melacha. Ravina says, you're right. We got a little off track over here. Kroch v'tani. Bring all of this together and teach it as one cohesive halacha. Here we go. Daish. What does Daish teach me? Ma Daish miyuchad davar shlo nigmar malachto l'maiser. Just like threshing is different in that what? Lo nigmar malachto l'maiser. Both say meaning what? That halacha l'maisa, when you're threshing, the produce is not yet complete for meiser purposes. So the Gemara says, ulachala, and for chala purposes. So when you're threshing wheat, I will say, that wheat is not subject to meiser, and it's not subject to chala. Upol ochabo, and ultimately, again, the worker has the ability to eat from it. Af kol shalod nigmar melachto lemeiser ulachala, pol ochabo. So I will say, so bottom line, for our purposes, what do we take from this? Shabbos said it's very important. So now we have our three major criteria. In order for a worker to partake of produce he is working with, Shabbos said let's go through them. Number one, gedulei karka. It's got to go from the ground. Number two, b'shas kimar malacha. It has to be that whatever you're working with is fully ripened and fully finished. And now number three, not subject to any type of tithing. Whether that is challah, whether that's meiser, can't be subject to any type of tithing. Both say if you have those three criteria, then a worker, and by the way, whatever is going to be true for a worker is also going to be true for what? For an animal. For an animal, right? Because we have this linkage between your labor and your animal. Will be able to partake of it when you are eating. Incredible. All right, so we'll say, let's go. Ibay lahu. 5 lines up from the bottom. Ibay lahu, we're doing great. Ibay lahu. Poel, mao sheyahavhev ba'ar v'yocha. Okay, let's say if you remember again in yesterday's daf, we saw something interesting. Right? When the Torah frames the right of the worker, right? Remember again, when we speak about worker consumption, right? The Torah frames it in a case of, I hire someone to work in my vineyard. Shabbos says, if you remember again, the Torah says that he's allowed to eat from the grapes. So the Gemara Darshan, it's grapes for lo davar acher, not something else. That's meaning what? You can't take the grapes and dip it into salt. Right? Bless you. It's dafka, it's only the grapes, not anything else. Now the Gemara asks an interesting question. So, is the worker allowed to take from the produce and roast it, right? Heat it up in the fire and eat it? Now, we'll say, to imagine this, it doesn't work as well with grapes as much as it does with wheat. Right? Apparently, it was very common to roast wheat kernels. Apparently, it was quite delicious. Right? So now, again, I'm working in the wheat field, and I hire a laborer to go ahead and work in the wheat field. Now, he's allowed to eat from the kernels. Is he allowed to roast the kernels? Right? Is he allowed to roast the kernels while he's working in my field? So what's the shayla? Mi havi kanavim v'davar acher. Olo, is this considered roasting? Is roasting essentially considered to be like grapes and something else? In other words, is roasting considered to be like dipping in salt? And just like we established already again in yesterday's daf that you can't dip in salt because it's daf for grapes. Grapes is just a paradigmatic example. It's grapes and not grapes and a condiment, right? Not grapes and something else, only grapes. So again, do we say that roasting is like a davar acher or not? Interesting shayla. So the Gemara says as follows. Let's analyze Tashma. Rashai Balabais Lahashkos Polim Yayin Kadesh Lo Yochal Anafim Harbe. So this is interesting. So the Balabais, also remember again, and now it's all of our sigis coming together. Remember, when you hire workers, Stam Minagamakum was to feed your workers. So what could the Balabais do? He could give his workers more wine so that they'll eat less grapes. The idea being that wine satiates. So the Balabais has the right to go ahead and give them more wine so that they eat less. The Gemara says, "Rashai ba'alais lashkas polim yan kadesh lo yochlu anavim harbe." Rashai polim letabal pitam betzir kadesh yochlu anavim harbe. Oh, watch this. What say. So now the workers during lunch, they are permitted to go ahead and dip their bread right into brine. Tzir is brine. Apparently, bread in brine increases your appetite. So they're allowed to go ahead and dip their bread in brine in order to increase their appetite. Now, let's say, so what do you see from here? Now, it sounds like from here is that a worker is permitted to go ahead and do something to increase his appetite. Now, apparently, roasting the wheat kernels or even roasting the grapes whets the appetite a little bit more. So you see that it's mutter, to which the Gemara says, no. Amud Bezer will say, Lachshuri gaver lo kamei barivan. I will say, again, the worker has a right? The worker during lunch has a right to do whatever he wants. In other words, if he wants to dip his bread into brine, he's on lunch, right? He wants so that he'll eat more grapes. That's his business. The Gemara says, Ki kamiwal, and our shaila is lachshure peiramai. We're not asking about the rights of a worker to enhance his appetite during his lunch break, which is his right. So if he wants to dip his bread into brine and now he is ready to go and he gets back to work, he's going to be eating grapes like no one's business. That's fine. That's fine. I mean, I don't know if it's fine, but let me say again, that's his right. We're asking over here, does he have the right to roast the grapes? Or does he have, that he's picking, or does he have the right to roast the kernels that he's picking? That's the Shayla Mai. So Tashma, analyze. Polin, Ochlin, Anavim, Barashi, Umnio Shalahen, or Bilat Shalo Yahav Havu Bar. Oh, supposed to say this seems to be pretty explicit. What does the Brisa say? The workers have a right to dafka eat grapes from the front of the row. So here's what's interesting. So apparently, so not every part, right? Vineyards are arranged in rows. Not every part of the row necessarily gets the same amount of sunlight. So apparently, the vines on the front of the rows would often be exposed to the sun for the longest amount of time. Those would be the sweetest grapes. So the worker is allowed to decide, you know what, I'm not eating from here. I'm eating from the sweet grapes. He's allowed to do that. However, what can't he do? He can't roast the grapes in fire. So this seems to be pretty explicit that halacha l'maisa, as much as the worker is allowed to eat, he's not allowed to do something to prepare the item that he's working with in a way that enhances his appetite. So the Gemara says, no, that's a totally different issue. Hasam ishum bitul malacha. He'll say that's a different issue. Why does the Brisa say that the worker can't roast the grapes or the wheat kernels? Why not? Because the Brisa says it's going to take away time from learning. In other words, the Brisa says the whole chap of eating of the labor of eating is what? Eating while you work. In other words, you want to pick off a grape while you're working, that's fine. The point the Bryce is making over here is you can't pick grapes or pick kernels and start roasting them, right? Starting on a little fire, get the cheva around, take out the arak, right? You can't, that you can't do. So halacha l'maisa, the issue over here is bittul malacha, right? That's the issue over here. To which the Gemara says, ki kami bailad, heicha the ishta ubanav, mai. Let's say the following situation. Let's say again, the worker is doing his work. He picks the grapes. He gives his wife. His wife and the kids are picnicking in the field also. So he gives it to them so they can prepare it. So they can put it on the fire. So what's the halacha over there? So Tashma lo yahavei ba'ar v'yochal. The worker can't go ahead and roast whatever it is that he's picking and eat it. V'lo yichmar ba'adama. Nor could he bury it in the soil. I will say again, buried in the soil also heats it up. The soil is hot, heats it up. V'yochal. V'lo yafrech al gabi sela v'yochal. Nor can you crack it on top of on a stone and eat it. Aval machrech yad al yad v'ochal. What you can do is I will say, so apparently, if you want to make something a little bit sweeter, both kernels and grapes, if you crack it or you mush it a little bit, it unlocks some of the sweetness. So you can't go ahead and put it on a fire, can't bury it in the soil, you can't crack it against the rock. What you can do is roll it in your hand a little bit. So we'll say, so it seems to be pretty explicit that what? That a worker can't go ahead and roast the grapes or roast the kernels on a fire. You're not allowed to, in other words, you're allowed to eat it straight, but you can't do any additional process, because the additional process would effectively be like dipping it in salt. Tushar says, no. Hasam mishum b'dom malacha. No. Once again, the issue over there, I will say, is what? Is b'dom malacha. Is that all these things take time, and you're on the clock. You're on the clock. So because you're on the clock, you can't do other things, ultimately, again, while you're being paid for work. Hachanai Mistarol says, it seems to be clear, because if it's about sweetening the fruit, we'll say, what sweetening of the fruit is there when you smash the fruit, you smash the grape, the kernel against the rock? Tushimar says, no, it's not true. It's not true. Again, whenever you smash something, whenever you break it, there's always some additional sweetening that occurs. I'll say, by the way, a tremendous Moshe skill like this, right? Sometimes, in order to unlock the flavor of something, you have to break it. And I will say, if you think about it, this is the secret of Klal Yisrael that no one understands. The world looks at us and they don't understand how it is that after thousands of years of persecution, thousands of years of difficulty, thousands of years of war, I will say, we're not only in existence, we're thriving. We're not just thriving, we're building, we're expanding. How does that happen to a people who are perpetually beaten down? And also, you see this it's every day, right? The army had to launch an attack in Rafah to kill certain Hamas operatives. Unfortunately, there were civilians killed. That's because terrorists hide amongst civilians. So now again, it's another whole round. No, we're not even allowed to kill our enemies. Not even kill. Again, no one asks, "Hey Chevra, hey Hamas Chevra, why are you hiding in refugee camps?" Right? No, that's never the shaila. It's always us. So think to yourself, how could it be that a people who are so highly scrutinized, beaten down, terrorized, every single horrible atrocity that you could ever imagine that one human being could do to another has been done to us? And yet I will say, there's no greater people, there's no stronger people, there's no more optimistic people, there's no more hopeful people, there's no nation in the world that builds and grows. And how does that happen? Because I will say, we discovered the secret that when you break it, the sweetness comes out. The greatness of Klal Yisrael is when you break us, we just find greater energy within ourselves. When you hurt us, we just dig down for more sweetness. When you crack us open, we'll just find greater kedushin, greater strength. That's what the world doesn't understand. They break us in order to destroy us. And the great thing they never understand about Klal Yisrael is, the more they break us, the more holiness, strength, and beauty comes oozing out. Just like the kernel of grain against the rock. The harder you smash it, the sweeter it becomes. The harder you hurt us, the harder you hit us, the sweeter and the holier we become. Secret of Klal Yisrael, both say. Let's go back there. So Tashma. Now both say, now the Gemara says, thank you. Right, so the Gemara, MS, David, right? MS. So both say, so Tashma. Paul and Shayoja. So we'll say, now the Gemara kind of leaves this open a little bit, right? The Gemara doesn't go ahead. The Gemara doesn't really come to a conclusion on this. So we're not finished, just kind of hitting the pause button on this just for a moment. So watch this. So Tashma. Paul and Shayoja B'Teilim, V'Gojim B'Tamarim, U'Botrim Ba'anavim, U'Moskim B'Zeisim. So we'll say, these verbs, by the way, of Godrim, Botzrim, Moskim, are all the same word. They all mean to gather. It's just interesting about saying, Lashon HaKodesh is very specific. So there's a different word for gathering for different types of produce. It's fascinating, I will say. It's absolutely fascinating. So again, what happens over here? So if you have workers who are gathering figs, right? Gathering dates, gathering grapes, gathering olives. Hari elu ochlim upotrim. Ultimately, again, I will say, so what's the halacha? The halacha is, pturim. So ultimately, they are permitted to go ahead and eat, right? So workers, again, this is our topic, they're permitted to eat. Upturim, shatorah zichsa lahem. Because the Torah ultimately, again, has given them this right of consumption. Now, watch this. Bepitam lo yochlu, ele imkein natlu mershus me balabayis. However, now listen to this. What can't you do? You can't, right? Someone say, so like the workers work, so let's say the workers, we'll call him Ruvain. Ruvain's working in the field, right? He's got his olives, so he's allowed to eat olives as he's eating. What can't he do? He can't take out his pita, right? It's suddenly start making himself a whole falafel over here, right? So that you can't do, right? So you can't eat the olives with your pita, right? Why not? Because I will say again, that will increase his appetite. So in other words, the license is you can eat whatever you're working with, but you can't start adding on additional things. Here's right. Ella imkain, not l'rishus balabayis. Now listen, obviously, if you got rishus, if you ask the balabayis, do you mind if I bring my pita with me? While I'm working, I have a little bit of pita with the olives. If the balabayis is sure, then that's fine. And where it's below yispos, bamelach, v'yochal. And I will say furthermore, you can't dip the olives, I'm using olives as the example, you can't dip these items into salt. I will say, you can't dip it into salt. Rashi says over here, lo yispos yitbol kasagadait mishum anav v'davar acher. However, lo mishum meiser. So we'll say, now listen to this. Now we'll say, now what's the logic over here? So the Gemara says, v'yochal. So we'll say, so you can't dip it into salt. Now why? Because we'll say, b'pashtas, we're assuming over here, because the Torah says, you're allowed to eat anavim. You can eat grapes. But not anavim v'davar acher. Not grapes and something else. So the Gemara says, melach v'adai anavim v'davar acher. So both say, so certainly salt. Everyone agrees that you can't go ahead and dip the produce into salt, right? Everyone agrees with that because both say the pasuk itself says you're allowed to eat the grapes, but not the grapes and something else. So the Gemara says, I'm sorry. So melach vaday kanom v'davar acher dami v'lo yispos verlach v'yochal. So I'll say therefore the pasuk. So therefore the Gemara says that you're not allowed to go ahead and dip it into salt and eat. Or immediately the Gemara is the kasha. Watch this. Hasochas apol ader ulakash kishtachas hazesim. Harei zet lo yochal. I was supposed to say, so now watch this. I hire a worker to go ahead and la'ader, like literally again to weed underneath the olive tree. So what's the halacha? Harei zet lo yochal. The worker can't eat. Now we'll say, now why can't the worker eat? Now we know this. Why can't the worker eat in this case? Why not? It's not Gimar Malacha. Remember again, I will say, I'm hiring a worker over here to do some weeding. Meaning the olives are still on the tree. This is not harvest time. It's not harvest time. So it's not Gemar Malacha, therefore the worker is not permitted to eat. Sachro livtsar, right? But if I hire the worker to harvest the olives, so the Gemara says, Sachro limsok, Sachro lelakate, hareza ochel upater. Now I will say, now remember again, if halach l'maisa, I hire the worker to harvest, then what? Then halach l'maisa is allowed to go ahead and eat, and I will say pater. Pater means pater for meiser. Right? There's no tithing obligations yet. Torah zichsalahem. Because we'll say these are examples where the Torah gave the worker, gave the worker the right to go ahead and eat while he's working. Katzatz achos yochal. So we'll say now this is actually interesting. We're gonna have to frame these cases in the right way. We'll say now katzatz Rashi says over hisna balabayis amra she'ochal havelei kemechach. Now we'll say now we're going back for a second. We're talking now in a case where the worker is not entitled to eat from the produce. So case number one is where there is a biblical entitlement. When is there a biblical entitlement? If you conform to the three criteria. Gidulei karka, grows on the ground. Gimar malacha, finished, and ultimately again, not subject to meiser. Okay? Now we'll say that's case one. Case two is katzatz. So I'll say, so now katzatz, ultimately again, katzatz achas is talking about a situation where the worker is not biblically entitled to eat, for whatever the reason. But he made an agreement with the balabayis that he's allowed to go ahead and eat. So what's the halacha? Katzatz achas v'achas yochal. So we'll say if he goes ahead and he eats it one at a time, then ultimately again it's permitted. Shtayim lo yochal. Two at a time he can't do. Now what's the pshat? Take a look at Rashi. Rashi says over achas ochel right across in Rashi. Tepachos mishtayim lochayel iser shem goren b'davar shalom nigmar malachto. And I will say now, remember again, in this situation, essentially, because the worker is not entitled to eat biblically, and therefore he made some type of side arrangement with the balabayis, so therefore again we view his consumption as a sale, as a purchase. Now in general, I will say we saw this before. When you purchase produce, that automatically catapults the produce to shas Gimar Malacha, to make it subject to tithing. So now watch this. So if you eat it one at a time, so eating something one at a time essentially makes it that it's not subject yet to meiser. If you eat it two at a time, that volume automatically makes it subject to tithing obligations. Take a look at Rashi. Shtayim lo yochal. Rashi says, "Tishtayim michimati lehu milsa de chashivusa kegon ketzitza omeka chayil ala Hashem goren." I will say, once you eat produce 2 at a time, so that already gives it a chashivus, an importance. That importance already makes it subject to tithing obligations. So let's go back to the Gemara. So I will say, so case number two is where worker is not entitled biblically to consume. He makes a side deal with the balabayas that allows him to eat. If he eats the produce 1 at a time, he's good to go, no tithing obligation. 2 at a time is problematic because that'll make it now a tithing obligation. Okay? So the Gemara said, the sofis b'melach v'yochal. Now the Brisa said he's allowed to dip it in salt and eat it. So the Gemara says, ahiyah. What is that phrase referring to? When are you allowed to dip into salt and eat? Ilei ma'aseifa. So we'll say, if it's the last case of the Brisa, kevan dekatzatz, since they made an arrangement with each other, kol hechi debai lechol. Then we'll say, remember again, if it's dealing with the seifa was a case where the worker is not biblically entitled to consumption. Therefore, he made a side deal with the balabayas. If they made a side deal with the balabayas, then he could dip in whatever he wants. It doesn't make a difference. Elalav aresha. Rather, mostly talking about the resha. Amr Abaye lo kasha. It's not a contradiction. Kan ba'aretz, kan b'chutz la'aretz. So we'll say, we're talking about 2 different cases. One is in Eretz Yisrael. So we'll say, so now what we're saying over here is going on the resha. Now, what was the resha? The resha is a case of biblical entitlement. Right? Biblical entitlement. Where halacha l'maisa, the worker is working in the field. His work satisfies the 3 criteria: gedule karka, right? Mechubel karka, shas gemar malacha, I'm sorry. Not subject to meiser. Right? So now we'll say. So now the Brisa is saying he's allowed to dip it in salt. What? We just got finished saying before he's not allowed to dip it in salt. So what's going on over here? Gemara says it's not a kasha. Rabbi kasha kan ba'aretz, kan b'chutz la'aretz. Wow, so interesting. They'll say maybe one is talking about a case of Eretz Yisrael, and one is talking about a case of Chutz La'aretz. How so? The Gemara says, Ba'aretz kava sfisa, b'chutz la'aretz lo kava sfisa. So we'll say apparently in Eretz Yisrael, the act of dipping the olive, grape, wheat, or whatever it is in salt, ultimately again makes it a finished product and subject to tithing. Outside of Eretz Yisrael, where there is no tithing obligation, the act of dipping it in salt is halachically meaningless. Fascinating. Look at Rashi for just a moment. Kan baretz kan b'chutz la'aretz usfisa la mishum anavim v'davar achar le'inyan dinar naked la ela mishum chashivos achila le'inyan meiser. See, I will say, we always thought up until this point that the issue of dipping is that it represented an additive, a condiment. And the halacha is that the worker is allowed to eat the produce, but not the produce and something else. The Abai is saying, no, that's not it. The problem is actually dipping it in salt makes it a finished product for tithing purposes. So the problem is in Eretz Yisrael with his tithing obligations, if the worker takes the fruit and dips it in salt, he's triggered a tithing obligation. Well, if you triggered a tithing obligation, as I always said, then what did you do? If you trigger a tithing obligation, then what? Then the laborer has undermined his own ability to consume the produce. Because criteria number 3 of laborer consumption is it can't be subject to meiser. Now you dip it, it's subject, and therefore you undermine your own ability to consume it. In chutz la'aretz, outside Eretz Yisrael, where there is no tithing obligation, dipping it in salt is totally fine. Incredible. Amar Rava said, I don't understand. Mi'ika midi de be'eretz kavas svisa midaraisa, u'bechutza la'aretz lo kavas svisa mutar l'chatchila. So Rava says like this. Could it be that you have something that in Eretz Yisrael is aser? Right, so dipping the olive, I'm using the olive as an example. We'll say dipping the olive in the salt is going to be aser because it triggers a tithing obligation. And in chutz la'aretz, it's totally mutter. As I was saying, generally the way halacha works is like this: is that something that is going to be aser mid'oraisa in Eretz Yisrael is usually what? Going to be aser mid'rabanan in chutz la'aretz. The Gemara just finds it intriguing that you could have something that is totally unequivocally aser in Eretz Yisrael, and yet in chutz la'aretz it's totally mutter. It just sounds strange. To which Gemara says, "Ela Amar Rava." Rather, we'll say, "Here we go. Get ready for it. Here it is." Rava says, "Bein ba'aretz, bein b'chutz la'aretz, chada lo kava svisa, tarti kava svisa." So we'll say, so Rava says like this. Rather, here's what it comes down to: both in Eretz Yisrael and in chutz la'aretz, dipping of one item will not go ahead and establish a tithing obligation, but dipping of 2 will absolutely go ahead and and establish a tithing obligation. Now watch this. Let's bring this all together. Here we go. Katzatz. Now katzatz refers to a case where the worker is not entitled to eat. Right? He's not entitled to eat for whatever the reason. He made a side deal with the balabayis. So katzatz, if they made a side deal, bein safas ubein lo safas, whether he dipped it or he didn't dip it, as the Gemara says, achas ochel, he could eat as long as he's eating the produce, one unit at a time, one grape at a time, one olive at a time, one kernel at a time. Shtayim lo yochal. But I will say, Allah might say can't eat them two at a time. And I will say now again, why can't he eat them two at a time? Why not? Because since this is a side arrangement, it has the status of a sale. A sale, by definition, always catapults produce to a higher level of completion, thereby triggering a tithing obligation. So if the worker doesn't have an entitlement to produce, so now here into the balabais, he made a deal. Balabais said, okay, I'm okay with you eating produce. That's like a sale. Because it's like a sale, therefore what? The worker could eat it one at a time. But he can't eat it two at a time. He can't eat 2 grapes at a time, 2 olives at a time, 2 kernels at a time. Why? Because Rabbi say that is chashuv, because that's important. Because it's chashuv, because it's an important unit. Therefore, what? It triggers the tithing obligation. And once there's a tithing obligation, he can't eat without tithing. Lo katzatz. So we'll say, what happens in a case where there wasn't an arrangement? Now we'll say, what does it mean there's not an arrangement? That's a case of biblical entitlement, right? Where the worker is able to go ahead and eat because he's entitled to it. So here we go. So lo katzatz, velo safas. Say if ultimately, again, when we say there's no arrangement means that the worker is biblically entitled to go and eat the produce. Velo safas, and this is a case where he didn't dip anything, then what's the halacha? Ochel shtayim. So Rabbi say, if it's a case, so watch this. Rabbi say, this is the important part for us. If it's a case where halacha l'maisa, because this is what I'm dealing with the entire time, a worker who is biblically entitled to eat produce. So if he's biblically entitled to eat produce, we'll say, then what's the halacha? So again, remember, he can eat as much as he wants, right? You want to pop in a mouthful of grapes? Go for it. Make it right, knock yourself out. As long as what? As long as you're not tipping anything. Right? So as long as you're not tipping anything, biblical entitlement says, eat whatever you want. Okay, now watch this. So, lochaz lo savas, ochel shtayim. Safas, okay. Now what happens if the worker dips? So remember again, this is our worker who is entitled to eat biblically. He's a worker satisfying 3 criteria. Grows from the ground. Number 2, shaskim melacha, and not yet subject to tithing. So now both say, so this guy, so again, if he's not dipping, he can eat as much as he wants at any time. What if he is dipping? He's dipping the olive in salt. So what's the halacha? Safas, achas ochel. He can eat it one at a time. Right? Shtayim lo yochal. 2 at a time you can't. Why? I will say because the act of 2 at a time with dipping already elevates it to a higher level of completion, which would then trigger the tithing obligation. Even if he has permission from the balabayis to dip the olives, he's still not allowed to do it 2 at a time. 1 at a time you could do. Once you're dipping 2 at a time, I will say that already looks like a more finished product and triggers the tithing obligation. The Gemara says why? The kava sfisa. Because I will say again, at that point in time, when dipping 2 at a time, it becomes tevel, and you trigger the tithing obligation. The tarti, the kava sifsa minolan. By the Rabbi says, so now I just want to point out, if we kind of go ahead and bring this whole sugya together, we'll say, here's what we got. Get ready for it. If you're a worker who's working in the field and you are biblically entitled to eat, when are you biblically entitled to eat? 3 criteria. Gidulei karka, grows from the ground. Number 2, gemar melacha, finished product. Number 3, you have not yet triggered the tithing obligation. Can you dip the item that you're picking in salt? And the answer is, it depends. When can you do it? If you're doing it 1 at a time. Right? When can't you do it? Anything more than 1 at a time. Why not? Because apparently dipping 2 or more items essentially establishes right then and there a tithing obligation. Tithing obligation, to which the Gemara says, where do we know that? The Gemara says, Amrav Masna, the Amrakra, he quotes over the Pasuk. From Micha, the Pasuk says, Ki kapsam ka'amir grona. For you've gathered them together like a pile for threshing, for the goren. So also the idea over here is, since it's phrased in the plural, so the minimum unit of plurality is 2. So essentially, once you have 2 things together and you're dipping them, Ultimately, again, that becomes goren, that becomes a finished product, and halacha l'maisa becomes subject to tithing. I will say, shkoyach. Incredible, incredible.